Hello, and welcome to Cornell University. I'm Jens Olin, Interim Dean and Professor of Law at Cornell Law School. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's presentation on promoting public-private partnerships in the pursuit of cybersecurity. The domain of cyberspace offers seemingly limitless possibilities, but also new challenges for both public and private actors. Today's panelists are working at the forefront of these issues, and I'm grateful that they have taken the time to share their wisdom and insights with us. General Keith Alexander, the founder, chairman, and co-CEO of IronNet Cybersecurity, is one of the foremost authorities of cybersecurity in the world. A retired four-star Army general, General Alexander was previously the founding commander of U.S. Cybercom and also director of the National Security Agency, and was responsible for directing our nation's military cyber defenses. Jamil Jaffer is the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute and an assistant professor of law and director of the National Security Law and Policy Program at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. He's also senior vice president for strategy, partnerships, and corporate development at IronNet's Cybersecurity, the technology startup founded by General Alexander. Sarah Krebs is the John Wetherell Professor in the Department of Government and adjunct professor of law in the Cornell Law School and the director of the Cornell Tech Policy Lab at Cornell University. Her teaching and research focus on the intersection of international politics, technology, and national security, and she is the author of 5 books, including most recently, Social Media and International Relations, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. Our panel today will be moderated by Professor Krebs. Sarah, I'll turn things over to you, and I look forward to a stimulating conversation.
Thank you, Professor Olin. That was an excellent introduction. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Professor Olin himself is an authority on the subject. He's the co-editor of Cyber Law, Law and Ethics for Virtual Conflicts, published with Oxford in 2015. So let me just say a word or two about where we'll be going from here. General Alexander and Professor Jaffer will each offer about 5 to 7 minutes of framing remarks. I'll kick off with a few discussion questions, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. So please do submit questions along the way, and we'll be happy to take those. So General Alexander, over to you.
Thanks, Professor Krebs. It's an honor and privilege to be here. I'm from upstate New York, so I feel right at home. I'm going to talk a little bit about my thoughts on cyber, where we are today, where we're going, and what that means for our future. When you look at this rapid change that we see in our digital infrastructure, I believe what we're seeing in cyberspace is we're on the brink of a digital arms race, where adversaries are using cybersecurity attacks as an element of national power for everything from destruction to intelligence gathering to extortion. It's an existential economic and military threat. Attacks continue to grow in sophistication, size, and number, and are emerging as the biggest crisis of our time. So what do we do about that, and what do we see coming our way? When you look at the growth in the internet itself, it's doubling every year. The amount of data, the number of devices, the computational capability, what's going on with the cloud, everybody's going digital. And COVID has only caused to accelerate that growth. And along with the capabilities that we're seeing in the digital space, which are amazing, it's also room for a lot of risk and a lot of threat to our nation. I want to step back and just quickly hit some of those threats and then talk about where I see us going at a higher level. When you look around the world, we as Americans normally focus inward and say, oh, we see what's going on in New York, we see our political fights. But when you step back globally, starting with China, China represents the biggest transfer of wealth in history through the theft of intellectual property. We've seen that go on for more than a decade. And some say the amount just this year is in excess of $500 billion. So it's a huge transfer of wealth going to China, and it's our intellectual property, it's our future. What concerns me, though, is where are our relations with China and what does that mean for the future? If you step back, when Xi Jinping took charge in China, he really saw the fact that China was humiliated in World War II. And his comment, that will not happen again, ever. So the buildup of their military, the pushes that you're seeing in Hong Kong, what you're seeing in the South China Sea, and their aggressive statements on Taiwan serve to create, from my perspective, this huge set of tensions that I think will be in existence over the next few years with the US and China. And when you think about those tensions, think about all that they've done in cyberspace. Goes back just 10 years. Not just the theft of intellectual property, but when you look at all the attacks, from the Aurora attacks on Google to the Office of Personnel Management, the theft of about 21.5 million records, Anthem, 78 million records, Equifax, 145 million records, and Marriott, 500 million records that they stole. Why are they stealing those? That gives them insights on how to access networks and go forward. I believe we're going to see China as the biggest issue that we have to wrestle with as a nation, both diplomatically and potentially in the cyberspace. It's in their doctrine to use cyber as an element of warfare against a technologically superior force. That would be us. So put China over there. Russia. When you think about Russia, look at all that's going on now. You know, President Biden just said President Putin's a killer. Called out the elections, security, and all that's going on. And if you think back about what Russia has done over the last 15, 14 years with Estonia, with Georgia, with Ukraine, and the facts of their attacks taking over Crimea in 2014, up until just this last week, 100,000 troops amassed on the border of eastern Ukraine. And a lot of people are saying cooler tensions, but what better time when the world's in disarray? You've got COVID, you've got the things in India, and you've got all these problems going on to take over property that they see rightfully as theirs. And if that happens, what does NATO do? Where do we go? And what would they do if we tried to push back? So if you look at both China and Russia, and then you think about solar winds, Russia, demonstrating that they can attack 18,000 companies without being detected for 6 months. And the attacks by China, a brazen attack going after 30,000 companies when Microsoft published some vulnerabilities, and they didn't care if we saw it. In my opinion, that's a message to Congress, to our administration, to the American people, is we can get you in this space, we own it. And you're not ready to fight in it. Now, just to make it a little bit worse, you know, there's good news, I'm sure, someplace, but not here. Because the next one's Iran. Think about what's going on in Iran. In the Middle East, you can see that Iran and the Gulf states are almost in a low-intensity conflict right now. You look at the attacks just last summer on Iran in terms of explosion on 26 June in Parchin. You saw explosions at a medical facility out of Tehran on June 30th. Natanz fire 2 July, 3 July at the Shiraz power plant, 4 July at the Akbaz power plant. They were being hit systematically. And oh, by the way, they were hitting Saudi Arabia, they were hitting Iraq, and they were hitting Kuwait. So you see this ongoing. And what's at risk? Well, they just announced they're enriching uranium to 60%. The race to a weapon, a nuclear weapon, is a very real problem. And I'll tell you my experience, if the Israelis think they're going to get to a weapon, Israelis will conduct more attacks and ensure that doesn't happen. And you've got a war in the Middle East. And then you've got the Don King lookalike in North Korea. And okay, so I probably am not supposed to say that in a law class, but it does look funny. Okay, so when you think about this, what's he doing? He's using cyber to get money into their regime. Ransomware, ad fraud, stealing money from banks. So when you look at these threats and then you add in all that's going on in the criminal side, and then you step back and you look at our nation and you look at our allies, you realize we're not ready for these types of attacks. We really aren't. Everybody is defending their own. Everybody's fighting by themselves. And nobody can tell the government when they're being attacked in time to do anything about it. SolarWinds is a great case in point. When you think about it, with SolarWinds, what happened? We saw that in SolarWinds, 6-8 months before anybody detected it, that would be time to wipe out 18,000 companies worth of data. Think of what that would do to our economy. So everybody working by themselves is not working. And there is no way to share that between these companies and the federal government. When I ran U.S. Cyber Command, we had the responsibility to defend the nation. My comment to Secretary Gates and Secretary Panetta is you can't do that job. And the reason? We can't see attacks on the country. Those attacks are invisible to the government. And what the government is left to do is incident response. That means all the destruction has happened. It's all over. And now the government comes in. That's not cyber defense. That's recovery and resilience. That's after the fact. We need to get out in front of it. And that's where I think the public-private partnerships, and we can talk more about that, that's where we need to take this country. And we need to work our way through it. That's the future for us in cyber. Thanks, Professor Krebs.
Thank you, General Alexander, for those wide-ranging remarks about the nexus of geopolitics and the cyber threat. Professor Jaffer, I'm hoping that you can be a little bit less doom and gloom and just make us feel a little bit more optimistic.
Well, Professor Krebs, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks, General Alexander, for employing me and for being here today, and to the law school for having us. Look, I just want to hit on a few points that General Alexander made. One, look, cybersecurity is a growing challenge, right? We've seen an explosion in the growth of smart devices, connected devices, the Internet of Things. That means there's been a massive increase in the quantity, the speed, and criticality of information transiting the global Internet, right? General Alexander pointed out that cyber is increasingly being used as an element of national power. We see key actors conducting deliberate and destructive attacks. We also see key actors, like in the case of SolarWinds, establishing long-term footholds. The economic effects are massive. You heard General Alexander refer to the theft of IP, which he referred to back 6-7 years ago when he was the commander of U.S. Cyber Command as the greatest transfer of wealth in modern human history. Cybercrime on top of that transfer of wealth of intellectual property, which totals in the trillions and billions of dollars a year, trillions total, right? Cybercrime alone this year will be $6 trillion. And there have been 7.1 billion identities stolen in the last decade alone, right? You might think to yourself, well, that's a lot of identities. Of course, we each have more than one identity on the internet, right? You think about this expansion of cyber attack surface. The global IP traffic next year is expected to reach 4.8 zettabytes. You might say to yourself, what is a zettabyte, right? I'll just give you a perspective. That's about 3 times the amount of traffic in 2017 and more than the total IP traffic total from the beginning of the internet till 2018, right? 5.3 billion users on the internet by 2023, 29.3 billion devices, 3 devices per human being on this planet by next year. Attacks happen fast. It takes attackers typically minutes or less to get into a system. And from the time they're in to the time they own your system, have admin rights over your systems, is typically measured in single-digit days. And yet defenders remain slow, right? In the majority of cases, it takes victims weeks or longer to identify a breach, right? And the median time for breach discovery breach is about 50 some odd days, which is down significantly from over 100 days just a few years ago, right? And you might think to yourself, well, okay, this all seems pretty bad. And, you know, Professor Krebs said, well, maybe you can give some good news. Unfortunately, while we would have thought that perhaps COVID-19 would keep everybody busy and less focused on cyber activities or other activities, we've actually seen it go the other way. The global threat environment remains challenged, right? Our adversaries remain aggressive, right? Their domestic challenges, whether it's in Iran with the significant number of the members of the Iranian modules being infected by COVID-19, right? Potential economic dislocations and the like, have resulted in actually our adversaries, whether Russia, China, Iran, or North Korea, getting more aggressive. We see classic cyber espionage, like we saw in the case of Solar Storm, the case of the Microsoft Exchange hacks. We also see data breach, ransomware activities. We even see attacks focused around COVID, right? And the response and recovery infrastructure, both disinformation, misinformation attacks, but also affirmative acts to identify the intellectual property that makes up the vaccines that we're developing and potentially redeploying those, right? So we see a lot of these things happening. And you might say to yourself, well, this is all really terrible, right? But General Alexander laid out some ideas about ways that we might come together as a nation, industry with other industry with government, that public-private partnership, right? You might say to yourself, well, why do we need that, right? Why can't we just fix this the way we normally deal with it? The government should just solve the problem for us, right? Because you think about it, in the normal world, we think about a government coming after us. It's not the job of, say, Target or Walmart to defend against a Russian bear bomber coming across the horizon. We expect the government to do that. Sure, we want Target and Walmart to have high walls, high fences, armed guards at their warehouses, maybe even guard dogs. We don't expect them to have surface-to-air missiles on their buildings. So why not that way with the government, right? Why not in cyber, right? Today in cyber, we do expect not just Target and Walmart, but Citibank, JP Morgan, every mid-sized bank in America, every small bank, every small mom and pop owned business to defend against every single cyber threat, whether it's a script kiddie in their basement, right? A nation state attacker like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and everything in between. And so say to yourself, how can JP Morgan defend against this, right? We don't expect them to do it in the regular world. Why can we expect that in cyberspace, much less all the medium-sized or small-sized entities? And the answer is what General Alexander just described. The only way to do it is to do it at scale. You've got to get companies working with other companies. You got to get them sharing information, but not just sharing information, collaborating, working together in real time across companies, across industries, with the government. Because again, without government scale and knowledge, industry is not going to be capable of identifying all the threats and going up against them, right? It'd be great if the government could do that job, but think about the resources it would take and think about the requirements it would take in terms of obtaining information about what's happening on the global internet and the like. And we're not prepared as a nation to do that today, not us nor our allies. And so you've got to figure out how to bring industry together with one another, how to do it with our government, and then how to get governments to work with other allied governments to really address this threat. Fundamentally, it's a paradigm shift to collective and collaborative defense, the same thing actually that the Cyberspace Solarium Commission called for in the report they released about a year ago. So we'll talk more about that in the questions, but with that, I'll leave it there. Professor Krebs, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I didn't mean to imply that we shouldn't have doom and gloom if that's warranted. I think it's more important that we get a realistic view of the cyber landscape than pretend that things aren't threatening. I do want to kick off with a couple of questions, but I'm already getting some from the audience. So when you describe, we know of the prominent attacks. You had talked, General, about the SolarWinds hack, which Microsoft, the president of Microsoft, referred to as, quote, the largest and most sophisticated hack the world has ever seen. And so, does the fact that we have these types of hacks mean that we aren't doing a good job of defense, or how do we think about? There's this whole kind of, let's say, denominator of attacks that maybe were attempted that we stymied. How can we think about measures of effectiveness of our defense in a world where it's hard to, and not hard, but impossible to patch every vulnerability? We hear about the successful attacks. How can we kind of put this in perspective?
Well, first, I think there's a lot more going on than we have visibility of. Those on offense, for the most part, go undetected. And why do they go undetected? And the answer is because they know how you do your defenses. I would liken it to the Maginot Line in 1940. If you think about what the French did, they said, okay, the Germans have always come across these points and we're going to put in these huge stone foundations and we're going to defend forward and we're going to put all this out there. And then lo and behold, the Germans went around and did a left feint and came through the forest, and they were stuck in their Maginot Line, and the Germans had an easy ride all the way into Paris. And now you think about cyber. We protect with something called rules, indicators of compromise, which are signature-based rules. And those signatures are indicators of compromise that are like a hash algorithm. Think of it as a barcode. And the issue is the adversary can adapt the barcode to get by the rule. So that's one part. Or they can get somebody to click on an email, phishing, or any other vulnerability that wasn't patched, and they're in. And once they're in, the current system expects them to be looking at these sets of things and you don't see anything. They're back in there stealing everything in your network, and that's the current state. So what do we have to change to? And this is my belief, is that we have to change to something called network detection through flow data. And this is how you look at all the packets of information and you use behavioral analytics to detect it. People are going to say, yep, behavioral analytics too hard. Yeah, it's really hard. But the reality is, it's like going the difference between static warfare to mobile warfare. And in cyber, the mobile warfare is actually tracking them down as they're trying to get in your network and being able to hunt them throughout your network with some capability like behavioral analytics and expert system and other things. I say that because that has a huge capability that comes with it. If you think about sharing information on signatures that you already know, what are you going to tell people? I just blocked a signature. Well, so did everybody else. So what do you share? And the answer is nothing. Everything you share is what you've just found, and you only share what you know you found once you've gone through all the liability protections. What do you need to share? You need to share what's going on with your network that the government can help you defend against. Think solar winds. And so it is actually identifying those types of activity, sharing it with the government in an anonymous way so that the government can figure out why is the SVR or Chinese actors trying to get into our country. We, the private sector, have to do that. We have to create what I will call an air traffic control system for cyber so the government can see what's going on in time to protect us. If we don't do that, everything else is meaningless. They can get in, they can destroy everything they want. You know, with 6 months' time, I could have taken 5 months off and still accomplished everything we wanted to do in destroying our country. Think about that. We're not ready. We need to get out in front of this.
So, Professor Jaffer, you can kind of weigh in on that as well. But what I might do is use the comment about the air traffic control system as a segue to a slightly different question, which is that we have a government that is structured largely around a pre-cyber world. And so are the bureaucracies set up to be most effective at defending against the threats we face? And what do you propose bureaucratically or legislatively to bring us up to 21st century threat standards?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I'd say two things. One, you hear a lot of talk today on Capitol Hill about the need for data breach legislation so we can report about data breaches. You hear talk about the need for an NTSB for cyber to deal with crises once they've happened. But as General Alexander described, think about if you set up an NTSB, right, the National Transportation Safety Board, to investigate air crashes without having air traffic control system. It would be crazy, right? It makes no sense, right? But as we know today, we don't have an air traffic control system, a radar system for our cybersecurity, yet we're talking about setting up an NTSB, right? It's putting the cart before the horse. You're talking about, let's figure out how to stop, how to deal with plane crashes. We don't even know where the planes are, right? We don't know where the threat is coming from. And so John Alexander is exactly right. We've got to create that capability to identify the threats. And the more we talk about data breach, we talk about NTSBs, that's great, that's important. But it doesn't solve the before the fact problem. How do you stop the attack before it happens? And so, one of the things that General Alexander, when he was at NSA and I was at the House Intelligence Committee, that the committee and the government worked together on, the executive branch and the legislative branch, was legislation to authorize the sharing of data, right? To provide certain protections and certain authorities for industry, for government, for industries to collect data, to share that with the government and to collaborate with one another. You could make some changes to that bill. That bill was ultimately enacted in 2015, the Cyber Information Sharing Act. There are things about that legislation that could be improved. You could improve the liability protections. You could improve the regulatory protections. You could make it easier for industry to share with anybody in government they wanted to instead of going through one path. And you could also ensure that industry doesn't have to take all these additional steps in order to share with the government, make it easy for them to do that. That's one thing you could do to make things easier. Another thing you could do is the Cyberspace Solarium Commission recommended that we create what's called a joint collaborative environment, an environment where different government agencies could take the data they have, bring it together, and collaborate with one another in real time over that data. That's great. We should certainly do that, but we should go beyond that. It's not just the government agencies that need to collaborate with one another. It's the government needs to collaborate with industry. And industry needs to collaborate with one another. We should invite private industry now into this joint collaborative environment and do it not in 2 years from now, as the Cybersecurity Steering Commission recommended in their legislative proposal, but we should do it tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, because we are already behind the 8 ball. We're already suffering huge damage. People talk about whether we're in a conflict in cyberspace today, right? I think there's no question we are in a series of low-level conflicts, right? It hasn't risen to the level of war yet, but we are bleeding day in and day out. It's not just intellectual property. It's all sorts of other damage too. And lest we think that, oh, well, these data breaches, they're just sort of sui generis, right? The reality is that the massive impact they can have once you take all this data, right, collected about all of us, whether through data breaches or the like, and you start putting into really capable machine learning algorithms, these algorithms can now assess human behavior. And it's all about the data you put in. If you're putting in quality data about people, whether it's their financials, their biographical data, their security clearances, this is powerful information. You combine that with information from TikTok and WeChat and all these other apps. That's a lot of information that can drive really interesting decision making.
So we've been, I have a couple other questions, but I'm getting some really interesting ones from our audience. So I'm going to turn to a couple of those. So both of you have talked about the threat from China. General Alexander, you talked about Russia and Iran, but what about non-state actors? This is a question from Amelia. How should we consider the threat posed by non-state actors, including private individuals that are not clearly sponsored or affiliated with state governments? How do they fit into cyber priorities and public-private partnerships?
So I'll start with that one. I think the biggest issue that we see right now is the fact that these individuals, what I'll call your cyber criminals, a majority of them do have a nexus with states. So when you look out there, they either came from the state or they're employed by the state, but they're moonlighting at night using state tools and state infrastructure. So I did mention briefly criminal groups. So I put all of them in the criminal groups. And what are they trying to do? They are trying to steal as much money and intellectual property as they can. And then they sell it back to their governments or to others for profit, or they ransom someone, or it's ad fraud. When you put all that on the table, there's a tremendous amount of money that they're making, the criminal side. The defense on that is the same as if it were a nation state. When you think about how do you defend, Jamil was hitting one part. When you look at all that's going on from the criminal side, one of the things that you should step back and take 90 mid-sized banks as an example. 90 mid-sized banks, each bank with 10 people are trying everything they can to defend that bank. And these criminals and these nation states are hitting them. And what do? They work as hard as they can. As Jamil and I pointed out, every year the amount of information that they're working with doubles. So their job's getting twice as big, but they can't hire twice as many people. And think down the road, there's another 89 banks like this, each with 10 people. Now imagine, what if those, instead of 10 people trying to defend, you put 900 people together? Which would be better for the defense of those banks? 10 people working by themselves or 900 working collectively? That's part of the solution that we have to put together. And so I think criminals are a big part of it. They're stealing a lot of money. I think the amount for ad fraud and ransomware, it's doubling, 350% increase between Q2 and Q3 last year. It's huge. It's the same thing. It's the same issues that we're wrestling with on the nation state and the non-nation state side.
Professor Jaffer, do you want to jump in there?
No, I agree with everything my boss said.
So we have a question from Ahmed, who is raising the issue of not just national security challenges, but civil liberty and violations of privacy by the government. And so this is actually something I was curious about as well. So I'll kind of tie it to a question I had about a recent story in the Wall Street Journal that suggested that foreign governments are staging cyber attacks using servers in the U.S., seeking to avoid detection by intelligence groups in the U.S., both because we're not looking there, but also because of legal impediments to domestic surveillance. So how should we think about threats originating within the U.S., either from foreign groups that are staging them in the U.S. or actually from domestic groups, while considering these relevant constitutional issues?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's a very real threat. I mean, it's not just a Wall Street Journal story. We saw the director of the National Security Agency say at point blank that we are blind here in the United States when foreign attackers use U.S. infrastructure. Now, you can, in theory, go get a court order, right, and use a Title III court order based on probable cause, but you have to assume you have the probable cause. Then you have to be able to serve it. You have to get access to that data, and then you have to evaluate that data. By the time that happens, the game is up, right? It takes too long, the burdens are too high, and it's a real challenge. At the same time, right, these are the rules that we put in place because we want to ensure that in the United States, we're not conducting, unwarranted surveillance, right? Now, we have limited exceptions to that. One thing that General Alexander worked on when he was the director of the National Security Agency, and I worked on when I was a lawyer at the Justice Department, was obtaining the authority for the government to conduct surveillance targeting foreigners overseas, located outside the United States, who are engaged in intelligence activities using U.S. infrastructure, right? And we obtained this authority called Section 702, right, which permits the surveillance of foreigners located overseas who don't have Fourth Amendment rights under our Constitution, but by using information obtained from U.S. service providers. And there's a process by which you go do that. You can imagine a similar construct for cyber threats, right? You can imagine a construct where we identify a foreign threat actor heading towards the U.S. shores with the cyber attack, and we want to engage in a hot pursuit of that into the United States, right? And you might imagine a construct in which you're able to obtain orders where you're targeting not people in the United States, but foreigners located overseas to identify these type of foreign threats that are exploiting U.S. infrastructure. We encountered this challenge after 9/11. We've dealt with that in the intelligence context. Perhaps it's now time to deal with that in the cyber context, and it's certainly something that needs to be considered and discussed. There are obviously privacy and civil liberties implications that we have to think through and work through, but it's an important thing to figure out given the reliance that we place on our cyber infrastructure today and the threats we know that are coming from outside the United States.
Yeah, let me add to that so to show you that we can actually go Mutt and Jeff. I'm not sure who's who, but when you think about what went on in SolarWinds, the Russians used actually a command and control site here in the U.S. just to get by this specific issue. So they set that up in August of 2019. So think of that. They planned that a year ahead. They're putting their command and control site into the U.S. knowing that tracking that back out would be really hard for us. So there's a couple things that we can do to add to what Jamil said. Commercial sector and private sector companies can work together to identify those kinds of nodes and tell the government where they are and who they're communicating with, because we can see actually more than the government can see in this space. And so when you think about it, we have, it's just like reporting a fire. If you want the government to help protect you in cyber, you got to tell them you're being attacked and where it's coming from. We've got to be able to do that. And then when there's an attack coming from a node within the U.S., then the government should be able to go in there without having to go through a warrant process, taking a week to get a warrant, proving to a judge it should be there. But if an attack is occurring, like SolarWinds, there should be rules set aside of how the government can go in and take it from there out. I think that's appropriate, and I think it's a path forward. So I think there's two parts to giving the government visibility. It's the private sector telling them what's hitting them, and then the private sector telling it where it's coming from so they can say it's over here. If this were a physical attack on our country and we had Russian Spetsnaz forces shooting at us, we could tell the government where they are. They're right over there. We couldn't say, well, shoot, we can't tell you because you're not allowed to know location data, and we don't want you using any imaging satellites here in the U.S. If they're shooting at us, we absolutely want them to go in there and blow them up, do something, get rid of them. It should be the same in cyber.
So we've talked about public and private. We've talked about states, non-states. We have a question from Yan Mi, who is asking about individuals. So us as individuals, how do we protect ourselves in cyber? Which I think is a great question. What would you do? What are your kind of internet hygiene practices? So
there's a couple things. I think, there's the basics. What do you do to protect your pass your passwords and stuff like that, and you're not using your wife's or your husband's name and birth date. So I did that early on back in the 90s. Okay, so we don't do that anymore. So LastPass does that. And you want to have these protections that make sense, LastPass, and you want to have LifeLock that can look at your accounts and stuff like that. Basic hygiene, I think it's worth doing, and many companies will help you do that. I think we have to go beyond, though, and I believe the community is actually going to do it. We came up with, what if we created a secure world where you share information on attacks that are going as businesses, and we start to secure all these companies with this really high-end security? Then individuals could opt into that, and they would provide the same level of insights of attacks going on, not giving up their personally identifiable information, not giving up the content of their communications, not giving up their names, but giving up the fact that an attack is occurring so the government could help secure them. I think setting up a secure world like that is going to be part of our future. And then you can opt in. And if you don't want to be in there, great, don't be in there. And I suspect that if you're going to do business online banking, at some point banks are going to say, you're not in a secure, you don't have a secure framework with us. I'm not sure we want you to bank with us because you're going to lose all your money. So I think we've got to think our way through it. The other part would be for people with children. I have 16 grandchildren. Thanks. I know I don't look that old. Thank you. But when you think about 16 grandchildren, they're all on the network. We want them to be safe playing on this internet. So you probably say, yeah, I would like them to be safe from all the abusers out there as well. So I think that's going to be part of the future. Jamil, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, look, there's, as General Sanders said, there's the basic stuff, keeping your password secure and the like, constantly updating your systems, right? You think about it, all of our devices, your iPhones, your Chrome browser, whatever it might be, all update very regularly, right? It's because they're constantly pushing security patches, right? Now, it's true that in the SolarWinds attack, right, a piece of malware is passed through the update cycle, right? But I think that you've got to rely on the update cycles are generally pretty secure, and now that we are sort of forewarned about the potential for supply chain attacks, big companies are locking it down. But if you're using commercially available products and keeping them constantly updated, you're in a pretty decent place, right? Then just sort of common sense behavior, right? The most common way even the most advanced attackers get in is phishing. Why? Because it works, right? And so you've got to be on alert for that sort of thing. And then what John Alexander described, in a lot of ways, the individual situation, right, the single human situation is not really that different from a large company and a series of smaller companies that work with them in their supply chain, right? That big company needs itself to be protected, but it's as vulnerable as its weakest supplier, right? If its weakest supplier can be penetrated, you saw in the case of Target, right? They came through an HVAC vendor, right? Same thing with humans, right? For all of our workplaces, all the places we interact with, if them remain secure, we have to be secure. And so creating this collective defense fabric that General Alexander described works for supply chains, but it also works for individuals. And so I think that's going to be the key pivot point if, in fact, we in the Cyberspace Solar Commission are right.
I appreciate these points. I wonder, I received an email from one of the students in this cyber law class earlier this week about an email she had gotten from this app Park Mobile, which is the app that's used to park, she said, basically anywhere in Ithaca, and they were notifying people of a cybersecurity incident linked to a vulnerability in a third-party software. Now, it looks like they were sending this out of an abundance of caution, and that no credit card information was accessed. But, we layer this on to the Target and the Marriott incidents. I mean, what is an individual to do? Is this sort of just the cost of doing business in the connected world that we live in?
So this is why I use LifeLock. When I was in government, my identity, along with all the other senior government leaders' identities, were stolen. And so you think the Marriott, you think OPM, you think about all these, the identities are stolen. They know your name, your social security number, your date of birth. They can start up credit cards, they can start up things, and all of a sudden you've got this huge bill and you didn't even start any of it. So what I did with LifeLock is they set that up. They monitor anything coming up in your name and alert you to it, and you can put a stop right on right away. I think that's one thing. That's why I recommend it. And the other was this LastPass. I don't have stock in either of those companies, but I do use them. And I think the reason is I like the way LastPass allows you to have a vault and a secure way of having really strong passwords. And then, taking care of all your system hygiene and stuff, that's all part of it. So I do think there are things out there that we should do. The most important thing, though, is as a nation, the private sector has to work together, and the private sector has to work with the government. 90+% of all our internet, compute, and all those capabilities are in the private sector. Our economy runs on this internet. And what the adversary is going to attack or steal from is that economy. That's our future. And they're stealing us blind. So this is where we really have to get out in front of it. And I think it's both the private sector and then individuals pushing for that.
Jamil, do you have anything you want to add there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think, one of the biggest challenges that we face is we don't control this data, right? There's a lot of this data that other people, third parties, have on us, right? Whether it's our credit card data, as General Alexander described, or the Park Mobile data and that information as your student described. And if they're not securing their data, well, then our data is going out the back door because they have failed at their job, right? You might say to yourself, well, this is really easy to solve. We'll just create liability rules. We'll allow you to sue them, and that'll make them better. Or maybe we don't need liabilities. Maybe we'll just have the FTC, police them through some sort of, unfair trade practices, regulation. And they'll go in and say, look, if you don't comply with your privacy policy or you don't have good enough cybersecurity practices, you can be fined through a regulatory process, right? That might be a fine way to do it. Here's the problem with both those approaches, right? Those are all retrospective, right? They don't incentivize good behavior. In fact, to the contrary, what they do is they actually just penalize behavior after the fact. And what's even more interesting is that this idea that somehow our regulatory infrastructure, the government that moves at a snail's pace on a good day, right, can keep up with the rapidity of technology change and nation state and criminal actors and the like. I mean, it's ridiculous. If you ever watch Hearing Up on Capitol Hill about any technology issue, right, the challenges that members of Congress face in addressing these issues, even with young, smart, technology-savvy staff, are astounding. You think a regulatory agency is going to be able to figure this out? That's a terrible idea. What you're really going to do is just simply create regulations that cause you to comply with those things. You're actually complying with things that are actually probably yesterday's technology, and you're actually going to be worse off, putting your customers in a worse situation. And so, I think this has to come from incentives, right? You got to go with carrots, not sticks. And there are a lot of incentives, right? You can imagine tax credits for companies that invest in cybersecurity defenses. You can imagine regulatory relief if you meet certain government criteria, right? Opportunities to bid on government contracts if you meet certain criteria, right? There's a lot of tools you might utilize that are the carrot rather than the stick, and that don't get the government in the business of sort of setting standards that it can never possibly keep up with in an industry that's moving this fast.
That makes a lot of sense. I wonder if that's in the discussions about the infrastructure bill, because that would seem to be quite relevant. One thing we haven't talked about, and I'm curious whether that's because it's not possible, and this is a question from Paul about deterrence. Is that something that we can kind of feasibly do, or why has that not come up? And what do you think about kind of deterrence versus this defend forward, which I think, General Alexander, I think I recall you did mention.
So I think on deterrence, I think it is doable. The issue that you're going to face, or that we face right now, is we're not in a defensible stance. So before we take on any offensive actions in cyber, we ought to fix the defense. So that's why we focus more on get your house in order and get ready for this, because it is coming. You look at what's going on with China, Russia, Iran, you look around the world, we are in a very dangerous situation. The bulk of our nation's financial future is in this network, and we're not ready to defend it. So we have to get out in front of that. That's part one. And two, if you're getting out in front of that, then you can look at deterrence. But deterrence goes far beyond just cyber in this space. You have to look at all the elements of national power: diplomatic, economic, military. and cyber and all these others. What can you do to explain to a country they shouldn't do this? At the same time, recognize that they get a vote. They're going to use cyber to collect information. There's SolarWinds, there's the Microsoft stuff. They're out there gathering information on us, and we are not doing anything to protect it. So we have to get out in front of it, and we got to practice it. And we've got to practice and train between our public and private sector and how we're actually going to do this. Because like it or not, commercial industry is going to be in this fight to protect their own companies and their economic future, while the government is trying to protect us as a nation. So we've got to get really good at working this together. But the bottom line is, I do think you can do a deterrence. You fix the defense, then when somebody comes in, you can send a strong message. And you have options to do it across that, and you can do it covertly or overtly. And sometimes you'll choose covert when you don't want to make this a bigger problem, just to say, we saw that, boom, take on this issue. Or overt when you want to send a more strategic warning. So you can do both. But I think first, if we're going to get into that, we've got to fix the defense.
Yeah, no, so I actually agree with General Alexander that deterrence can and does work in cyberspace. There's been a lot of talk, Professor Krebs, about this idea that deterrence just doesn't function in this domain of warfare, right? It's not effective. It's actually escalatory. In my view, nothing could be further from the truth, right? My issue is that we actually don't practice deterrence today in cyberspace. We don't talk about what somebody might do to get in trouble and what we would do to them if they cause a problem for us. We don't talk about our capabilities because a lot of the group on the intelligence side of the house, so we're not clear about what our capabilities are in the cyber domain. We're not clear about what non-cyber capabilities we might use against you if you come after us. And worse, on top of all of that, when people do cross red lines, more often than not, we don't enforce them, right? And so it's no shocker that deterrence doesn't work in cyberspace today. It's because we've shown ourselves to be completely incapable of actually utilizing common sense, normal standard deterrence theory that we've talked about for 40 years, right? If we were, in fact, instead to say, look, here are the things you might do to me that will get you punched in the teeth. And then here are the capabilities I have to punch you in the teeth with. Here's my fist, here's my cyber capability, here's my non-cyber capability, here's what I plan to use. And then when people cross those lines, if we actually, I mean, imagine if, right after when we set the red line about Syrian chemical weapons, and the president said, I'm going to respond to an attack on the Syrian people by the regime using chemical weapons. If instead of walking on stage and saying, I've decided to strike as commander-in-chief, but I want Congress to authorize it, and then when Congress wasn't going to authorize it, saying, well, I made a deal with the Russians, right? We're going to take those chemical weapons out, which was cold comfort to the thousands of Syrians who died of chlorine and sarin attacks after the Russians took all the chemical weapons out, right? If we instead simply enforced America's will, right, and said we're going to carry our red line, you might see deterrence being effectuated, right? And so, in the cyber domain, the same is true. Now, General Alexander is right to raise the point that we need to make sure our defenses are well squared away, right? But there's also something to be said for, we're never going to be perfect on defense. At some point, you have to be willing to say to the bully on the playground, hey, you punch me once more, you're going to get knocked in the teeth. And maybe it's easy for me to say that having sound silence, General Alexander, as a war fighter for decades, right? I've never had that role, so it's much easier, for the cheap seats to say that. But I'll be honest, I do think that being more aggressive and saying to our enemies, we're going to punish you if you do things and extract costs, and then actually doing it will be more likely to deter rather than sitting here watching ourselves sort of bleed slowly from these attacks.
So we have a couple of minutes left, and so I'm going to kind of take the liberty of combining a couple of questions that are overlapping. So one from Kenneth about a concrete example of a private public partnership that either you think is a textbook case of success or that you could envision. And a question from Larry, who is I think implying that he's one of these persons when he says, what would you say to people who say that the public-private partnership tends to be a one-way street in terms of information exchanges in the direction of the government?
So from my perspective, the most, I think, successful public-private partnership was something we call the Enduring Security Framework, where we set up a public-private partnership where you could share information back and forth between companies critical to the internet and those networks. I think you can see that now growing with things like the energy sector. The energy sector CEOs want to ensure the security of the grid and are actually really pushing that hard, and I think going in the right way. So I think there are concrete examples of that. What was the second part, Professor, on that one?
Of the maybe the question about whether this is not just a one-way street.
Oh, it's a one-way street, yeah. So I think the hard part on that, and we have to fix this, is the way we have to send information to go to the private sector through DHS. I think we've got to figure out, how does the government just send out information fast and quickly? Now, I think what the administration has really done a great job is they're picking some great people to run parts of cyber. Chris Inglis, Jenny Schley, pending confirmation, Ann Neuberger, Ron Moultrie, all these people coming in, and now General Paul Nakasone have worked together. And they know how to fix this problem, and they will work together to do it. So I think that's a great step for our country. And it's not that the government doesn't want to share it. It's that there's no real easy means to do it. That's why I think behavioral analytics becomes a pathway to sharing information very quickly and in a way that we absolutely need to do it in the future. So we have to give that way. I think the government shares a lot more than people understand. They don't get credit for it.
Yeah, look, I do think the government could do a better job about giving security clearances out and doing that faster, doing it more effectively, and getting not just unclassified and downgraded information out to the private sector, but sharing it in a classified form that the private sector can utilize and defend themselves better, right? I just think that, we do overclassify some information, and we don't share classified information enough with people that we could clear in industry, right? You know, the reality of it is a huge percentage of our intelligence collection, at least on the signal side, are collected by government contractors, right? Private sector individuals who've been cleared for working on behalf of the U.S. government, right? And so given that we can clear that many people, right, to do the actual collection, highly sensitive sources and methods, right, surely we can clear more people in industry at the CEO and CISO and operational levels and get them the data they need faster, right? It's just the government isn't in the business of typically doing that at scale. And we're on the business of sharing classified information at scale because we have this need to know theory of the world. And we've talked for, now over almost 2 decades since 9/11 about a need to share mentality. And a lot of that has changed over time. We need to get in the business of need to share when it comes to cyber threat data with the private sector. And the government's got to do better on that front for sure.
So one last quick question from Len Kennedy. He talks about the FCC's broad authority that could be used to require U.S. entities connecting to our telecommunications networks to use stronger security, encrypt traffic, report problem traffic observed in transport. Is this, and this kind of connects to maybe one other quick question from Steve, about how to improve or stand up a defense. How can we think about kind of the critical infrastructure and the kind of mechanisms at our disposal or at creation to kind of bolster those?
So I think it is more an issue of technically understanding how to see those things that you're not detecting today. And so everybody wants to share information, but they're not seeing it. So let's say that my way of gauging whether something is successful is played against solar winds. If you enforce that under solar winds, would anybody have reported it faster? And the answer is no, because they didn't see it. So the answer isn't the reporting part as much as it is the seeing part. Same thing on the China stuff. There's 48,000 companies that were hit. Nobody saw it. And when you think about that, you say, okay, really what we have is a detection problem. And so I would put the first thing, 48,000 to 1, get behavioral analytics up and running and make this a real world sharing capability and share it between the public and private sector at network speed. I think that's the big issue. Then once you get that, then you can look at the rules and regulations that the FCC and other parts of government have and put those together to work. Does that make sense? Jamil.
Yeah, no, look, I think that's exactly right. And I think that the Biden administration has an opportunity to really change the game in this space, right? I do think that they've, as General Sanders described, they've really put together, in some ways, a cyber dream team, right? Assuming the Senate confirms Jen Easterly to DHS CISA and Chris Inglis, National Cyber Director. These are all people who know and have worked well with each other over years and have really created one of the world's most capable defensive and offensive organizations. And so bringing that mentality and combining it with real cyber leaders in the private sector, folks, as John Alexander said, the CEOs of some of these cyber companies, the CEOs of some of these healthcare and financial companies who are forward-leaning and thoughtful. And there are members of Congress, like Congressman Gallagher, Ben Sass. You've got a number of members of Congress who are really Jim Langevin, right, who really understand this issue and are prepared to work with the administration to get stuff done. I think there's a unique opportunity on a bipartisan basis with some real leaders in the government to change the game in this space. And industry's poised to make the move also because they just see that they're getting owned every day and they realize they can't do it on their own either.
Well, that's great. We started on doom and gloom and we came around to a very hopeful endpoint. And so on that note of optimism, I'll turn back to Professor Olien for a couple of minutes of closing remarks.
Thank you, Sarah. Cyber conflict is a new but ever-present mode of statecraft, it seems. It's a form of gray zone conflict that is neither war nor peace. Cyber conflict is hard, but not impossible for both our government and private industry to deter and to defend against. And it's a challenge to regulate with traditional legal tools, whether national law or international law. The government obviously has a big role to play here, analogous to air traffic controllers. The private industry is an essential player as well. And I'm pleased to know that some of the smartest minds in government, private industry, and academia are dedicated to making our cyber lives as safe as possible. Thank you to our panelists, Professor Krebs, General Alexander, and Professor Jaffer for their thoughtful interventions. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Stay safe and remember to update your browser. Bye-bye.